Let's speak to Abdullah Al-Arian, an associate professor of history at Georgetown University. He joins us now from Doha in Qatar. Abdullah, thank you very much for your time. On this, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, how many people in the Middle East are looking at their own country's history over the past 100 years and saying that Western powers have created our problems?
Well, I think that certainly is a large part of the legacy of that First World War, especially in terms of not just breaking up the Ottoman Empire, but then installing a series of colonial enterprises throughout the region, dividing up countries between Britain and France in particular, and then, of course, the dispossession of the Palestinians and the establishment of a state there in Israel. And so I think the legacy of so many of the different conflicts that we've seen over the last century really stem from the events of the war and the breakup of one empire while expanding and empowering a series of other empires afterwards.
If we treat it very much as a non-scientific exercise, would you be able to theorize about where the Middle East might be or how it might be different if the Ottoman Empire had chosen to fight for the winning side?
Well, I don't know that there would necessarily be that much of a difference, because I think, as we've seen, even in the case of, let's say, the Arab populations who did side with the winning side, right? And here I'm talking specifically about the Arabian tribes who banded together and fought on behalf of the British in Arabia. We've seen their story memorialized in, T.E. Lawrence's story in film. That all of them, of course, ended up being the losers nonetheless. That when Sheikh Faisal emerges in Damascus and decides to declare an Arab kingdom there, an independent state, of course, he's pushed back by his French and British allies. And so I think that ultimately the colonial ambitions and the imperial ambitions that we've seen tend to outweigh even which side any of these various populations may have fought for. And I think in general, the First World War was vastly destructive for the Middle East. I mean, we've seen reports of something up to 20% of the population was killed during that time. We've seen, the massive famine and starvation, the complete appropriation of people's resources, everything from food to basic farming equipment was all utilized specifically for the war. So even if it wasn't a major theater in that war, it was still nonetheless, very destructive, and that impact continues to be felt.
Nowadays, of course, we know about the natural resources underground all over the Middle East. What about back then, in 1916, that secretive agreement between Britain and France, SykesPicot, which was going to divide up the parts of the Middle East which were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire? What was the motivation of the French and the British for this division?
Well, I think that it was about the preservation of their interests. I mean, the first issue between the various powers, that even within that alliance there were disagreements and there was competition. And so I think that treaty first and foremost represents a need to try and avoid outright conflict between two close allies in Britain and France. And so this was about dividing up the region in a way that would actually allow them each to respect the other's interests in various places. That had to do with their economic interests, their strategic military interests, and of course, as we see in the long term, comes to be seen as a way of preserving things like the access to oil, which comes along much later. But in the meantime, I think it's clear that those colonial ambitions tended to set up a scramble of nationalism, so to speak, that basically by the end of World War I, as the Ottoman Empire breaks up, there was a sense that these populations simply couldn't be allowed to govern themselves. And so now all of a sudden you have these powers who decide which countries should be allowed to become independent and along what kind of timeline. And in the meantime, they're exploiting their populations for their resources and being able to kind of impose a specific political order in the region. And so the map, although the map that we see today doesn't necessarily stem directly from SykesPicot, but it's very much a first version of what comes to be seen through a number of other treaties and agreements over the next decade, specifically through the League of Nations mandates. And the League of Nations as an institution, as an organization, comes along to try as much as possible to basically impose the conditions of who qualifies as a nation. And so you see all of a sudden these very destructive conflicts emerging across the region, in large part to try to meet those conditions, to try to say we are a nation, we deserve our independence. And so this basically sets up that kind of a scramble in a very counterproductive way.
How is Armistice Day, November the 11th, marked around the Middle East? Are there any events planned that you know of for this Sunday?
Well, I don't think that it's seen in the same way here as it is in Europe. I think that across the Middle East, certainly there's a sense that World War I is largely responsible for many of the outcomes and many of the national conflicts that continue to persist to this day. But I think because that there isn't a sense of finality to those conflicts, that there is not as much of a commemoration, and especially because, as I said before, that the actual battles, the actual theater wasn't really fought to the same degree. And so I think that this was certainly a holiday and certainly a moment of commemoration that tends to be far more expressed in the European context. And so I think in general, people think of World War I in the Middle East, and they're thinking far more about the aftermath, and they're thinking a lot more about the aspirations for national, sovereign states that comes to basically take over the successive years. And so more countries are interested in commemorating their days of independence into the 1920s and 30s far more than they are thinking about the end of the war itself.
Abdullah Al-Arian, we really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot for joining us on TRT World.